Okay. All right. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name's Mark Nussbaum, and I plan events like this for the library. That's one reason we have these sign-up sheets, if you like to, so we can let you know if you want to be notified of more events like this. This particular event is going to be our first video cast, so you may even be on camera. And I put these flyers on the back that describe the event that we're out in the hallway, because the address where you can see the video cast in about 3 days is listed on this flyer, and it is www.bclpodcasts.blogspot.com. And we also have a previous lecture that Mr. Kavan did that is excellent. So right now, without further ado, I want to introduce Eli Kavan. He's Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Columbia University and has been an adjunct lecturer at BCC and currently lectures at Nova Southeastern University. His writings have appeared in the Jerusalem Post, the Jerusalem Report, and Midstream. And again, you can listen to his previous presentation and see the new videocast at www.bclpodcasts.blogspot.com. Okay, welcome.
Mark, thank you. And thank you, Bob. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight's topic is the mysteries of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I want to begin with an incident that has really nothing to do with the scrolls, but occurred at about the time the scrolls were discovered. They were discovered in the end of 46, the beginning of 47, the spring of 47, but this took place in 1948. In 1948, President Harry Truman was in the White House, and he was meeting with President Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel. And they're talking, and President Weizmann of Israel goes to President Truman. He says, President Truman, my job as president is far more difficult than yours. And Truman doesn't understand. He doesn't understand what President Weizmann is saying. Because the presidency in Israel is a ceremonial position. It has no real power compared to the presidency in the United States. The president here is commander-in-chief, the power of the veto, et cetera, et cetera. So he said, President Weizmann, what do you mean your job is more difficult? So Weizmann goes to Truman. He said, President Truman, you are the president of 175 million citizens. I, on the other hand, am the president of 1 million presidents. And it's interesting. Coming from the Jewish community, I can tell you, Jews are as divided as Muslims, as Christians. Today, different Jewish denominations, Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, Ultra-Orthodox, Reconstructionist. However, you go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls 2,000 years ago, and one message I want you to leave this room with later on is that 2,000 years ago, there wasn't one Bible, there wasn't one Judaism, there were different groups had different holy scriptures, and among them are the Dead Sea Scroll community. Now, I'm sure some of you are here in order for me to investigate what impact the Dead Sea Scrolls had on early Christianity. Now, it's interesting. Jesus lived as a Jew, Jesus preached as a Jew, and Jesus died as a Jew. And in terms of the discoveries near Qumran, near the Dead Sea area, there certainly are parallels to the early monastic Christianity. There are parallels with the Dead Sea Scroll community in terms of monastic groups in early Christianity, but they are only parallels. There is really no good evidence of some sort of influence of the Dead Sea Scroll community, the writers and the copiers of the scrolls, on early Christianity. There are some parallels, as well as sort of living a monastic life. There is also the idea of apocalyptic messianism, which is certainly a part of Jesus' preaching. It is certainly a part of the book of Revelation in the New Testament. Certainly there are parallels, But I'll tell you, in terms of early Christianity, I would not point to the Dead Sea Scrolls to give us a real understanding. It gives us some understanding of the world from which Jesus emerged as a Jew. But in terms of early Christianity, the separation of the Jesus movement to become a separate religion, that really takes place years after the destruction of the writers of the Dead Sea Scroll, of this community, which was about 68 or 70 CE. And that's when the first gospel, the Gospel of Mark, is being written. So just a caveat, and that is that the scrolls, they tell us something in terms of some parallels with Christianity, but Christ, Jesus, is not mentioned in the scrolls. There is a hint in one fragment, I think it's about the size of my thumb, in a fragment of a Messiah either being crucified or crucifying somebody, but it's a very, very small fragment. And it's part of a much larger body of writings. So in terms of learning about early Christianity, I would point you in another direction. I would go to the Nag Hammadi Library. The Nag Hammadi Library was discovered at the same time as the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was discovered in Egypt. And what's interesting about the Nag Hammadi Library is that the scriptures found with the body of a monk in Egypt were those not of mainstream Christianity, certainly not of the Catholic Church. They were of Gnostic Christians. And their belief was very different than that of Paul. Paul's emphasis was on Jesus being a savior through the crucifixion and resurrection. And that became the mainline attitude of the Catholic Church and in terms of theology. But the Nag Hammadi Library is a different sectarian group. They were Gnostic. They believed that it wasn't the death of Jesus on the cross that saved somebody's soul, but it is the understanding of the secret meaning of Jesus' parables. And what's so interesting about this is it shows you, just like in in ancient Judaism, early Rabbinic Judaism, certainly in early Christianity as well, there is not one group. There are many different groups, there are many different beliefs, and that certainly applies to the Nag Hammadi Library, and in Judaism applies to the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the way I view the scrolls is really giving us not so much an early Christian story, but a Jewish story about late antiquity and the history of Jews in ancient Israel. Now it's interesting, you go to a store, either a Judaica store or a religious bookstore, Barnes & Noble, you plunk down your money, whatever it is, $25, you buy a Bible. Now it's the Bible, and it's been set that way for centuries, for over a millennium. And yes, there is one Bible, but the Hebrew Bible that we have was basically a text and a vowelization and pronunciation that was devised by the rabbis, by the early rabbis, around the year 70 CE. But again, don't be fooled. That is one Bible. That is one group, the rabbis' version of what the Holy Scriptures are and were. The Dead Sea Scroll community, and we'll see in a few moments, has a very different idea of what the Holy Scriptures are in their community. And there are other groups as well. The Samaritans, a group in northern Israel, they have their Bible, different in many ways from the Masoretic Rabbinic Bible, from the Bible canonized by the rabbis after the destruction of the temple. So what's so important about the foundation or the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls? There are a number of reasons it's so important. One reason is it shows us that the ancient Jewish community in Israel and Judea was a very divided community. There were the Pharisees, who were the forerunners of the early rabbis. There were the Sadducees, who were the priests, who were their opponents. There were the Essenes, who probably were the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There were the Zealots, who fought a major rebellion against the Romans and lost in 66 to 70 CE. So what's quite interesting and important about the Dead Sea Scrolls is they show us there is a community different than the Pharisees, than the proto-rabbinic community, than the early rabbis, that are coming up with holy texts that were not canonized by the rabbis, but were considered holy and sacred by the Dead Sea Scroll community. So that's one reason the findings are so important. Second reason, very important. Before the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls by Bedouin in 1947, or a little bit earlier in 46, the earliest manuscript we had of biblical writing dated back 1,000 years. It dated to 1000 CE, 1,000 years ago. And in terms of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, there was in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the findings, there was a complete scroll of Isaiah. And what's amazing is the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls takes us back another 1,000 years in terms of finding the earliest biblical manuscripts. So it's an amazing discovery that was discovered in 47 and later on in excavations in the Dead Sea Scroll area, because again, the oldest biblical manuscripts we had in Hebrew were 1,000 years old. Were only dated back 1,000 years. It's a long time, but it only dated back 1,000 years. With the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the finding of biblical scrolls of books that are found in the canonized Hebrew Bible of the rabbis, it takes us back 1,000 years. So in terms of the finding of the scrolls, there are a number of reasons it's so critical. First, it shows us there's diversity. There are many ancient Judaisms, not one Judaism. And as well, the discovery of these scrolls takes us back a further 1,000 years in antiquity to the oldest biblical manuscripts. Now, in terms of the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's quite interesting how they got into the hands of the different communities and different scholarly communities. I'm sure you've all heard the story. In 1946 or 47, there were a group of Bedouin who were leading their herd in the Dead Sea area, and they lost one of their flock. And they went in searching around the caves, and there was one opening in a cave, and in the hills around the Dead Sea area in southeastern Israel. And they threw a stone inside, and they heard something break. And they went in, and they found that they had broken a jar. There were 4 jars, pottery jars there, and they look inside, and wrapped in linen, there were these scrolls. Now, the Bedouin are usually shown as being naive and not knowing what they discovered, but certainly they realized they discovered something very important, and they brought it to an antiquities dealer in Bethlehem. And through certain channels, it reached a number of different groups. It reached a Syriac priest, a priest in the Syriac church, who was an Arab, who lived in Bethlehem. Eventually, he took some of the scrolls. He realized they were valuable. He made his way to the United States. Some of the scrolls came into the hands of Eliezer Sukanik, who was an archaeologist and a Hebraist at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, who was Jewish. And he bought some of the scrolls. What's interesting is that in terms of the way the scrolls came into the hands of the Israelis, the Syriac priest, he was in America, and he couldn't sell the scrolls. Nobody would buy them. So he put an ad in the Wall Street Journal. He was said that I have these about 10 scrolls. They're very valuable. I'm willing to sell them for $250,000. Now, going back to the early 50s, it's a lot of money today. It was a lot of money in the early 50s. But eventually, a donor from Israel gave them money. They bought the scrolls and brought them back to Israel. Now, what's interesting is there were 2 scroll teams. There were 2 groups that studied the scrolls. One group was in Israel, led by Sukanik and his son Yigal Yadin. They studied the scrolls at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. However, because the territory after 48 near the Dead Sea was in the hand of the Jordanians set up a scroll team as well. And the scroll team was made up only of Christians. Not all of them were believing Christians, and one of them was an agnostic, but it was a team made up solely of Christians, and they studied the scrolls in the Rockefeller Museum in East Jerusalem. So there were 2 teams. There was an Israeli team, a Jewish team that was studying the scrolls in Israel, and there was a team that did further excavations in the Dead Sea area in the 50s, and they were in Jordanian territory in East Jerusalem. Now, it's interesting. In terms of the way both groups studied these scrolls, they had very different attitudes. For the Israelis, for the Jews studying the scrolls were important as an historical find. But as well, you have to understand, in Israel, archaeology is also very much a part of establishing the legitimacy of a Jewish state in Israel. So the finding of these scrolls, most of them written in Hebrew, some in Aramaic, I think there was one in Greek, but most of them were in Hebrew or Aramaic. The discovery of these scrolls were a great propaganda coup for the Zionist movement, because this was definite proof that 2,000 years ago, there was definitely an organic connection between a group of Jews living in Israel and the land. There were Jews living there, studying the scrolls, living as Jews, worshiping as Jews who were living in the land of Israel. So the return of the Zionists to Israel in 1948, the scrolls prove it. Jews were returning to their homeland. It wasn't like 48 was the beginning, or the Zionist movement was the beginning of Jewish immigration to Israel. Actually, the scrolls and later on the Bar Kokhba letters, these are definite proof for the Zionists and for Jews that 2,000 years ago, and maybe even longer in terms of the scroll community, 2,000 years ago in the land of Israel, there were Jews who were studying these scrolls, writing in Hebrew, writing in Aramaic, who lived there, and the Zionists' return to the land of Israel was legitimate because Jews had lived in Israel 2,000 years ago. So for Yigal Yadin, one of the great archaeologists and statesmen in Israel, the study of the scrolls was not only of historical interest, it was also, and I say this positively, it was of propaganda interest, because it bolstered the claims of the Zionist movement of a strong Jewish connection to the land of Israel that went back millennia. So that is the way the Israeli team viewed it. That's the way the scrolls are viewed in Israel today. The Jordanian team was a little bit different in terms of its orientation. It was led by a brilliant man, a Bible scholar, Father Roland Deveau, who was a Catholic from France. He led the scroll team in Jordan. And he did most of the excavations of Khirbet Qumran, the ruins of Qumran that are near the Dead Sea area, and where these scholars found in 11 different caves either scrolls in pottery, in jars, scrolls lying on the floor of the caves, of libraries of scrolls on a shelf in these caves. But it's interesting. In terms of Father Devoe's orientation, his orientation was very much geared toward Christianity. His interest in the scrolls, and he was a scholar, he was a brilliant Hebrew scholar. I mean, he could read the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible and the original. He was a scholar of the Bible. But his attitude was that the community that wrote the scrolls, he believed they were at Qumran, which is the ruins of Qumran are in the Dead Sea area. He believed that it was a proto-Christian group. It was a group that eventually influenced the founding of the Jesus movement in Israel, in Judea, later on in Palestine, 2,000 years ago. That was Father Devoe's orientation. So basically, Father Deveau, we'll talk more about the community in a moment, but Father Deveau looked at the scrolls, and he very much had this feeling that the scrolls were part of a sort of a monastic community, a community that was dealing with apocalyptic messianism in much of the same way that early Christianity dealt with it. He found a very strong connection between the scrolls and Christianity, and early Christianity. But again, I have the question, when we talk about early Christianity, basically, up until the destruction of the temple, Christianity is not a separate entity from Judaism. Christianity is not Christianity yet. It is Jews who believe Jesus is the Messiah and are following the commandments of the Torah. They are what we would call Jews for Jesus, basically. So in terms of Qumran, and of the scrolls being proto-Christian, there's still many, many questions. And I'll provide you with a list of some of the different scrolls that were found, and it raises questions about Father Devoe's assumption. Also, it's an interesting side note. In terms of the scrolls, in Jordan, this team that studied the scrolls, they worked in very primitive conditions. What they did is they worked in an air-conditioned basement in the Rockefeller Museum. They put the scrolls in between two sheets of glass and put them in drawers. Now you have to realize, a lot of the scrolls were not in good condition. And those scrolls that were not in jars especially were in terrible condition because they had been on the floor. There was animal dung and dirt and deposits. Very hard to read those scrolls. There were small pieces. So the question is, how do you put the pieces together? Well, the scroll team in Jordan used Scotch tape on the backings of the scrolls to put them together. So when the Israelis captured East Jerusalem in 1967, they faced a major challenge, and that was, how do you get the tape off the back of the scrolls without damaging them? Now, I don't blame the Jordanian team. I don't blame Father DeVoe. That was the only means they had to connect these pieces of the scrolls together. It wasn't negligence. It was the fact that there was really no advanced technology like we have today. Today, the scrolls are being studied with advanced technologies, infrared and other technologies, computer software. These are advanced technologies that are enabling scholars to read different parts of the scrolls that are in pieces. But this was the sort of condition these scholars were working under 50 years ago in Jordan. Now, why do I cast an aspersion on Father DeVoe's orientation in terms of the scrolls being proto-Christian or being sort of, not even a parallel, but being the core of maybe John the Baptist or early monastic movements or the Jesus movement in Palestine or in Judea? Well, there are a number of reasons I'm not sure that that's the answer. First of all, for Father DeVoe, he knew who the writers were. They lived at Qumran. And those of you who have gone to Israel or who will go to Israel, you'll go to Qumran, which is in the Dead Sea area near the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you'll go into the ruins and you're going to see a table. And the table, there's a sign on the table that says, this is part of the scriptorium. This is the table where the scholars put out the scrolls, which were basically from animal hide. There was some papyrus, but most of it was animal skin. And they'll say the scriptorium. This is where it was written. And this is where they baptized. And this is where the purification was done, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Father DeVoe is taking a great leap of faith because we don't know. We just don't know if the community at Qumran were the scroll writers. In fact, there are two mysteries to the Dead Sea Scrolls. One mystery is 40 years ago, we were pretty sure who wrote them. Father DeVoe was pretty sure it was a monastic proto-Christian group in Qumran. Over the past 40 years, that has been challenged. And today we know very, very little about the people who wrote the scrolls. The scrolls could have been written at Qumran. The scrolls could have been a library that had been taken from Jerusalem and was deposited in these caves to hide them from the Romans who were attacking in 68 CE after the Jews rebelled against the Romans. We don't know where they're from. And the texts don't really help us in telling us who they were. Let me just give you some idea of what they found, what archaeologists found in the Dead Sea Scroll area, in the Dead Sea area of the scrolls. First of all, it's very interesting. They found the community rule, the rules for the community. There were certain rules for the community, communal meals, a period of initiation, sharing of wealth. This is all part of the rules of the community of the Dead Sea Scroll writers. And they call themselves the Sons of Light. They don't really tell us who they are. They say they're the Sons of Light. They are led by a man named the Teacher of Righteousness. We don't know who that is. Their opposition is a man called the Wicked Priest, a Jewish priest, a Kohen, probably the high priest, and I'll discuss why in a moment. The Wicked Priest. And then they say there's a group called the Kittim, which might be the Romans. But the problem is the scroll writers knew who they were talking about. We don't know. We have the scrolls and 2,000 years have passed, and we don't really know the subjects of the scrolls, who they're talking about. Who are the sons of light? Who are the sons of darkness? All we know is what we have here is a community that was a sectarian community. They didn't believe they were sectarian. They believed they were the mainstream. But a community that, for various reasons, believed they were being persecuted by the high priest in the temple. And I'll get into the reasons why in a moment. Why would the high priest persecute them? Okay, another scroll, the War Scroll. It's called the War Scroll. The War Scroll describes a 50-year apocalyptic battle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. Sounds a little bit like Star Wars. But good and evil. And it's obviously, in their eyes, this is a final war between their group and the Romans, who were dominating Judea at the time. And it's a 50-year war. It goes back and forth, but at the end, God is going to come down with the angels and lead a victory of the Jews over the Kittim, who are probably the Romans, and that is this final apocalyptic battle. Now, it's interesting. If the Qumran community or the Scrolls community is proto-Christian, perhaps the War Scroll fits into Christian theology in terms of apocalypse, but it's very much the goal of the community of the scroll writers is definitely an overthrow of the Kittim, who are probably the Romans. So in terms of an agenda, it's not what I would call a Christian agenda in terms of the sort of victory they envision, a military victory over the Romans. As well, there are things called Pisharim, which are Bible commentaries. The Qumran community, or the Scrolls community, we don't know if Qumran is a community, but if the Scrolls community, they looked at a part of the Bible, a part of the prophets, Isaiah, Habakkuk, Micah, all these prophets. And what they did is they said, the description in these prophetic books are describing events in our own time. By the way, you know that from today. There are people who say the Bible is a code that predicted the world wars, predicted the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, predicted the establishment of the State of Israel. Well, the Scrolls community had their own idea of a Bible code. They believed that the prophets of old, who lived centuries earlier, were predicting events in their own time. Now again, no mention of Jesus, no mention of a Messiah as a Savior, but interpretation of the prophets. And very much the same way the church interpreted the Old Testament as a harbinger of the coming of Jesus as the Messiah. So the Scrolls community did much of the same thing. They said the prophecies are predicting what's happening in our own time in terms of their attitude toward the Hasmoneans, the Jews, Jewish leaders, whom I'll discuss, and the Romans as well. Also, there was the Copper Scroll. This is an amazing scroll. It was written on melted copper. And on the scroll, it's the only scroll in copper. And by the way, when the archaeologists in Jordan discovered it, the only way they could open it was by bringing it back to England and sawing it in half to open it. So the scroll is still readable, but it's been kind of mangled. But the Copper Scroll lists treasures. It's a treasure hunt. It lists treasures from wealthy Jews in Jerusalem. It mentions treasures from maybe from the temple that are hidden all over Israel. And by the way, scholars and fortune hunters have tried to use this text to find treasure, and they have not had any luck. So again, we can't read the mind of people who lived 2,000 years ago. They knew where these treasures were, but obviously we can't find them. So that's another part of the mysteries of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Copper Scroll. As well, there were commentaries and midrash on books of the Hebrew Bible. Midrash is exegesis of the Bible, studying Bible stories and the narrative and adding to it. They did that as well. Another important facet of what was discovered. By the way, every book of the rabbinic canonized Bible was discovered, a part of the book, except for the book of Esther, except for the story of Purim. That was not discovered among the text on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Question is why? It's a good question. Why the Qumran community didn't celebrate Purim for some reason. However, very important, and again, I wanted to leave you with this message. There were other books discovered, texts discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls that were considered holy by the scroll writers, but are not a part of the rabbinic Masoretic text of the Bible as we have it today. I'll give you some examples. The Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch was a book about Enoch. Enoch was one of the descendants of Adam before the flood. And it said in the Bible, God took him. So there was a whole literature that talked about how Enoch was taken by God up to heaven, how Enoch saw the heavenly realm and went on a mystical journey. This book was adopted by the Scrolls community as a holy book. If you open a Hebrew Bible today, you will not find it. But the Book of Enoch was a holy book for the Scrolls community. not for the rabbis, not for the early rabbis who didn't include it in the biblical canon. Also, the Book of Jubilees. This is a book of 50-year cycle of Jewish history based on Jubilee, the 50th year. Again, this is a book that was holy to the scroll writers, but was not canonized in the Hebrew Bible. It was not part of the Hebrew canon. So, in terms of another example, the Genesis Apocryphon. This is a rewriting of Genesis. Again, we have the book of Genesis in the Bible, but the Genesis Apocryphon is not in the rabbinic version of the Bible. So, in terms of these findings, they show you that this community had holy scrolls and holy texts that may have not been holy to the later group of rabbis who were living in Judea 2,000 years ago. Just one more scroll that interests me, that's the Temple Scroll. There was a scroll, an idealized version of the temple, and I'll tell you why they wrote it. This is what happened. We're celebrating Hanukkah soon, for those of you who will be celebrating Hanukkah. Hanukkah, you all know, is a holiday of the great victory of the Maccabees over the Hellenists who persecuted them, who defiled the temple. The Maccabees were able to recapture Jerusalem in 164 BCE. They rededicated the temple. We have the miracle of the oil, one cruse of oil lasting for 8 days. That's the story of the victory. What people don't talk about is what happened after Hanukkah. What happened after Hanukkah is that the Maccabees established an independent kingdom in Judea. They established an independent kingdom, and they were priests, they were Kohanim, they were priests, who served in the temple, but they were not high priests. They were not the chief priest in the temple. But that was the most powerful political and religious position in Judea in the ancient world. And in order to lead the Jewish community in Israel, they took for themselves the high priesthood. And eventually the monarchy as well, which they didn't deserve because they weren't from the line of King David. They were priests. This angered the writers of the scrolls. The fact that the Maccabees were not high priests, yet the Maccabees assumed the high priesthood. So when in the scrolls, the scroll writers discuss an evil priest persecuting the sons of light, they are probably talking about one of the Maccabees who adopted the high priesthood. Now, after they adopted the high priesthood, many of the members of the Qumran community said, well, they're corrupt. They are not high priests. They should not be in charge of the temple sacrifice. Therefore, they said, we are going to leave the community. We are protesting the fact that the Maccabees are taking what is not rightfully theirs. So in terms of an evil priest persecuting a teacher of righteousness, we have a pretty good idea that the evil priest is one of the Maccabees. So you all know Hanukkah, the Maccabees are a positive influence, and they were. Judah Maccabee was a great man. Judah Maccabee was a hero. But what eventually happened was there was eventually a civil war in the Hasmonean kingdom. And one of the kings, the Jewish kings, Alexander Jannaeus, crucified 600 Jews in this civil war. So in terms of relations between the Scrolls community and the priests in the temple, the relations weren't good. The Scrolls community thought that the Maccabee priests were illegitimate. They didn't deserve to run the sacrifices in the temple. They believed that they were the ones who were going to eventually return back. The scroll community was going to return one day in sort of messianic times. We're going to repurify the temple and restore the correct priesthood, get rid of the Maccabees, and that would be the restoration of the high priesthood to those who deserved it. So in terms of the idea of the sons of light and sons of darkness, it really comes down to that. In that period of history. Now, the dates of the scrolls go from about 130 BCE, 130 years before Jesus, to about 70 CE, 70 years after the birth of Jesus. So part of the history of the scrolls is definitely dealing with the Hasmoneans, with the Maccabees, the relationship between the scroll writers and the Maccabees. Well, eventually the Maccabees lose power. And the Romans are a superpower. The Romans dominate Judea. And once you get to around the year 10, you have the beginning in the scroll writings of arguments and of the idea of war against the Romans, of overthrowing Roman domination of Judea. So we have two periods in the history. One, the sons of light and the sons of darkness in terms of internal Jewish politics and the high priesthood. Later on, it's a battle between Jews and the domination of the Romans of Judea. And the Romans ruled Judea for 70 years under direct governors from Rome. So in terms of the scrolls, they're both anti-Maccabee in a certain sense, and they're anti-Roman as well. Now it's interesting. Father DeVoe, he dies in the early 70s. And again, he was a major force in understanding the scrolls. By this time, as many of you know, in 1967, Israel recaptured the old city of Jerusalem, and they captured East Jerusalem. They got hold of the Rockefeller Museum, where much of the research was going on. And Father DeVoe died, and his position was taken by John Strugnell. John Strugnell was, I think he was born a Protestant, converted to Catholicism. But John Strugnell, a brilliant scholar. All these men were brilliant. And there were no women on the scroll team, but all these men were brilliant. They were brilliant scholars. Father DeVoe dies. John Strugnell takes over. The Israelis now have direct control of the study of the scrolls, but they allowed John Strugnell to continue studying the scrolls. Now what happens is this, and this leads to a lot of confusion in terms of the modern history of the scrolls. We discuss more of the ancient history, but in terms of what's happened over the past 50 years, in terms of scroll research. Now, the scholars who studied the scrolls, especially in Jordan, but in Israel as well, thank you, Mark, they were very reluctant to release their information. They were very reluctant to say what they discovered. And it led to a lot of questions. People say, what are they trying to hide? Why is it taking so long for them to produce translations of the scrolls, to present photographs of the scrolls? Why are they holding on to it? So there were theories that there was something, a tremendous revelation about ancient Judaism, or there was something about Jesus, about early Christianity that was going to devastate the church that was in the scrolls, and that the reason that the scholars didn't release the scrolls was because there was something shocking about the scrolls to early Christianity or to rabbinic Judaism. Well, that wasn't the real reason. I don't know how many of you have been involved in academia. I am currently in grad school. I went back to school after many years of being out of school, but I went to Columbia. And you look at the academia, and academics are very possessive of their research. Now the question is, who gets the scroll's copyright? Shouldn't the scroll copyright be to the people who wrote the scrolls 2,000 years ago? Of course it should be. But in fact, the researchers who found the scrolls, they were very possessive. They did not want to release their findings because first of all, they hadn't made complete studies of the fragments they had, but as well, they were very possessive of their findings. They didn't want to reveal it to the whole world. They wanted to hold on to it until they were good and ready to release the information. So the fact is, for many years, the scrolls were shrouded in mystery because the scroll scholars refused to release the content of the scrolls. John Strugnell was one of these scholars who refused to release a lot of the information, a lot of the scholarship. He got himself into real trouble. He had a history of mental illness, which is one of the claims he made for what he said. But he said that he made statements in the early 90s to the Israeli paper Ma'ariv. He said Judaism was a primitive religion, that Christianity was coming to perfect Judaism. Sounds a lot like Ann Coulter. But that Judaism is coming to be perfected by Christianity, that Judaism was a primitive religion in relationship to Christianity. He talked about the people who were interested in getting the scrolls, getting the copies of the scrolls, and he said, they're like fleas on my body. I get rid of them like this. They're nothing to me, the people who want to see the scrolls. Now there was a major campaign to get the scroll information released. It was led by Herschel Shanks of the Biblical Archaeology Review, which is an archaeology magazine on the Bible. And eventually, after going to court, after stealing photographs of the scrolls were finally all translated and released to the public. And by the way, you go into a bookstore today and you basically can buy all these scrolls. You can basically buy all the translation of all the scrolls that have been found. Now again, part of the finding of the scrolls is that that many of them were in fragments. They were very, very small pieces, size of my hand, size of my thumb. In terms of putting them together, it took a lot of high-tech equipment to try to decipher the scrolls. And thank God for computer software, for infrared imaging, for high definition. This has helped the scroll community, the scroll researchers, to study the scrolls. Now, just one other point in terms of the scrolls. There are many scrolls that are biblical, that were included in the Hebrew Bible, that was canonized by the rabbis. And you might have a question, how do they compare to the rabbinic canon? How does the scroll community, how do their biblical books compare? Well, I mentioned some of their books aren't in the Hebrew Bible, aren't in the rabbinic Bible. However, there's some interesting comparisons. You look at some of the writings in the book of Numbers, for example, in the Torah, and you look and compare them to the same writings found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls add a number of things. They're not really anything earth-shaking theologically, but there are extra added verses that are not in the Hebrew Bible that was canonized by the rabbis. So the point being that we talk about the Bible in quotation marks, but the Bible, you must remember, is the text of one community, of the rabbinic community, of the rabbis of Yavne around the year 70 after the destruction of the temple. Basically, in the ancient world, there were many Bibles. There was the Samaritan Bible. There was the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible. You had the Sadducee interpretation of the Bible, which was basically there was only a written Torah. You had the Pharisees who said there was an oral law as well as a written law. You have a lot of diversity. And in terms of what we call the Bible, I just want you all to remember, it is not only the Bible. There are many Bibles, there are many holy texts to different communities in the ancient Jewish world, as well as later on in the ancient Christian world. There are many different versions of what the Bible is. So you go to a store, you plunk down your money at Barnes & Noble, you buy a Bible, you are buying a Hebrew Bible that's a rabbinic Bible. It is not the Bible of the Scrolls community. And that is probably the most important message of the Scrolls. There is really nothing earth-shaking in terms of early Christianity or rabbinic Judaism or turn of the millennium Judaism 2,000 years ago. But what the Scrolls do show us is that the idea of Jewish unity, as well as Christian unity later on, but Jewish unity is really a myth. The Jewish community has never been unified. Like today, we have different movements, different denominations, different movements 2,000 years ago. Different holy texts. They didn't share always the same holy text. The ancient world of Judaism is a very varied world. It's a world of division. It's a world of disagreement. The only reason that we have that the rabbinic Bible is the Bible is that after the war with the Romans, the only group left standing were the Pharisees, who were the forerunners of the rabbis. The Sadducees were the priests. They were destroyed with the temple. The Zealots who fought the Romans were destroyed in Jerusalem and at Masada. They killed themselves at Masada. They were destroyed in Jerusalem. The Essenes, the group who probably were responsible for writing the Dead Sea Scrolls, another ascetic sort of monastic group, probably the group that wrote the scrolls. Again, they are overrun by the Romans in 68 CE and they disappear. The only group left standing are the rabbis. And the reason is the rabbis, instead of calling for an apocalypse against the Romans, they make peace with the Romans, they surrender, and it enables them to write the oral codes of law, the Mishnah, which is passed on to Babylonia, from Babylonia to Europe, to Central Europe, to Spain, and that's how Judaism survives. But in terms of ancient Judaism, the message I want to leave you with is there is not one the Bible. It is a varied community. There are many different versions of what the Bible is, and obviously the sectarians, if they didn't believe they were sectarians, but in terms of Judaism, later on they were sectarians at Qumran or the Dead Sea Scroll writers. We have a different community with a different theology and a different set of holy texts. Any questions or comments? I'd be happy to take your questions or comments. Yes? Okay, why are the scrolls found? That's a good question. Thank you for asking it. Why are the scrolls found, for example, in Aramaic? Yes, that's true. Most of them. The reality in Judea 2,000 years ago, and it was that most people, Hebrew was a literary language. Hebrew was a language of religion. The spoken language of day-to-day life, and that was through most of the Middle East, well, maybe not after Alexander the Great and the spread of Hellenism, but certainly Jews living in Judea 2,000 years ago spoke Aramaic. Aramaic was a Semitic language related to Hebrew, but not exactly like Hebrew. I can tell you I struggled for 12 years of my life with Talmud, with the rabbinic writings in Aramaic from Babylonia, and it is related to Hebrew, but my Hebrew is pretty good, but my Aramaic is not that good. However, Aramaic was the spoken language, and what they did, it's interesting, in Islam there's always been a lot of resistance to translating the Quran from Arabic into any other language. Not in Judaism. In Judaism, there were translations of the Bible into Greek, which is why, by the way, how Christianity spread through the knowledge of the Septuagint, through a Greek Bible written in Greek. But Jews as well, in terms of what was called Targum, translations of the Bible into Aramaic. When the Jews used to read the Bible in synagogue 2,000 years ago, or even 1,500 years ago, they would read 3 verses in Hebrew. Then there would be a translator who would read 3 verses in Aramaic, because not everybody understood the Hebrew, but everyone spoke Aramaic. So among the languages found basically are Hebrew and Aramaic. I think there was one in Greek. I'm not sure. And by the way, there was one Dead Sea Scroll, so there's one scroll that was found at Masada. I don't know what it was doing there. But there was one scroll related to the Dead Sea community that was found at Masada, and I don't know, maybe the Essenes or whoever the scroll community was had some connection to Masada. I don't know.
Where's that? My geography is really bad, I'm sorry. What you just mentioned, where is that?
Masada? It's in the Judean desert. It's south of Jerusalem. By the way, there's a yes, please.
How did the researchers arrive at a date for the writing?
Okay, in terms of arriving at a date for the writing, first of all, again, trying to interpret who the sons of light and the sons of darkness are, who the Kittim are, who the Romans are as the enemy. A lot of it initially, before, I think there was probably some carbon-14 dating of, not of the script, but of the parchment or of the papyrus. A lot of the early technology focused on the type of script. What a person like Yadin, who was a great Israeli archaeologist, did, and what the scroll team did in Jordan, is they compared Hebrew writing on stones or on archaeological findings and compared them to the writing in the scrolls. And the fact is, you look at the scrolls and the shape of the letters is not totally different. It's the same letters, but the shapes of the letters are different over time. So we have basically a Hasmonean script. We have a script in the middle period when Rome took over. We have a script in the later period of the Romans. So at least a part of the understanding of the dating was a comparison to the script found in other places in Israel and in the Middle East. That was part of it. As well, again, I'm not an expert on technology, but I know that in terms of technological ways to date ancient archaeological findings, there are other ways to date carbon-14 is an old way of doing it. There are certainly newer ways of measuring the date of the scrolls. But I'll tell you, in terms of the main way the scrolls were understood historically was through the shape of the letters. That was what was the determining factor in terms of understanding what was the date of the scroll community. Yes?
I'm assuming there's no vowel points,
No vowels.
no verses, no spaces.
No spaces, none. Now what's interesting, again, I talked about there's some, not major, but there are some differences between the biblical books in the Dead Sea Scroll community and that in the rabbinic community, but sometimes they're very minor differences. For example, the rabbis, I don't know if many of you are familiar with Hebrew, but there's an O vowel. And sometimes you use the letter Vav with a dot on top of it for the O vowel. Sometimes you just have a dot on top. And there are differences in the grammar and the way it was written in the Masoretic text, in the rabbinic text. and the way it was written in the Dead Sea Scroll text. Those are minor differences. There's some differences in terms of additions in the Dead Sea Scroll text that are not in the canonized Bible of the rabbis. But what I find so fascinating is the whole idea of a canon, the whole idea of a Bible. We think of it so much as written authority, and it is written authority, but we have to realize that the world of the Bible is a very fluid world, and the idea of a canon of a set number of texts, a set number of books in the Bible, that is the agenda of one group. And I'm not taking away from the rabbis. They were geniuses in the continuation of Judaism and the survival of Judaism till this day and Jewish life. But they are just one group out of many that had their idea of what the Bible was. But they were probably the most popular group, but they were the only group left standing in terms of leadership after the rebellion against Rome. And they were the victors. And as you all know, the victors write the history. And there is no mention of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the rabbinic writings in the Talmud, or there is no mention of that. So that community disappeared. It was eradicated by the Romans, and they were gone until, well, there were texts discovered before, but really until the major discoveries in the late 40s and early 50s, this community was off the radar screen, basically. As well as Masada, by the way. That's a different lecture, but Masada was off the radar screen as well.
Are you disappointed that there are no major revelations in this book?
Am I disappointed? No, because I'll tell you why. Because I think that in terms of this idea of variation, of differences, of a fluid canon, the idea that 2,000 years ago there was an idea of the Bible as being a lot more fluid than it is today. I mean, it's become sort of hardened and ossified into one text, into a group of holy texts. But I find it fascinating that in the ancient world, there were other Bibles. I think that's a testimony to how Judaism has survived, by there being differences of opinions, by there being arguments. I mean, unity is good, but unity is not always the answer. Sometimes there has to have to be differences of opinions, different theologies, arguments over what the meaning of worship of God is, etc., etc. So I'm not disappointed, because what it does is confirm something that I believe, and that's pluralism. There should be many different voices in the community expressing their ideas, and it was that way 2,000 years ago. It should be that way now. So for me, it's not a disappointment. It confirms something that I think is very important. As a human being, as a religious person, and as a Jew. Any other questions? Yes?
I don't know if it has to do with some of this, but like, why did they write it on animal skin?
Why? Probably it was the most available form of, first of all, the most available form of writing material they could find. The whole process of taking an animal and skinning the animal and taking off the hair and all these, it's interesting. By the way, the Hebrew word for getting your hair cut is lissaper, is to get your hair cut, and the word for book is sefer. And the reason is because when they took these animal skins, they would take off the hair. So they would cut off the hair. So it's like a haircut, but a haircut of the scroll to get to the skin. But also, there is an idea in Judaism that the holiest texts were handed down from Moses at Sinai on a scroll, on an animal parchment. Therefore, that is the holiest form of a Bible, not a Bible with vowels written on a piece of paper or on papyrus in the ancient world. The holy text would be written on parchment, because parchment was considered the holiest material to be written on. And that's basically what it goes to Gesundheit, Mark. That's what it comes down to. That there's basically this tradition. I don't know how early papyrus was used in Egypt, but the antiquity of the Bible, whoever wrote it, whether it's God or human beings or whomever, the Bible goes back a long, long way, and it may be probable that the only writing surface they had was animal skin when the Torah was originally assembled or given or whatever. So that's the reason it's written on the scroll till this day. So, for example, you read from the Torah on Saturday, on Shabbat, it's read from a Torah scroll from animal parchment, same way it was 2,500 years ago. Yes?
Could you give me, in your opinion, a prime example of a major theological difference within the Bible?
You mean between the two versions? The versions of the scrolls and the version of...
Of a different example in the Bible.
Um,
Kind of defies the other.
I'll tell you. I mean, the best example I could give you would not be of the... I mean, the Dead Sea Scroll community is certainly one possibility. I'll give you one example in terms of differences. The Dead Sea Scroll community, their calendar was a solar calendar. Now, that may not seem like a big deal, but it was, because the rabbinic calendar, the Hebrew calendar today, is basically a lunar calendar with some solar elements mixed in. There's a leap month, I think, 9 times every 17 years, an extra month to keep the holidays within the seasons. But that's one area of a major area of difference. Certainly for the Pharisees and for the early rabbis, the lunar calendar is the calendar. And for I don't know if it's the Qumran community, but the Scrolls community, the Dead Sea Scrolls community, the solar calendar is the calendar that Judaism is based on. That leads to a totally different interpretation of when the holidays are, when the sacrifices are supposed to be brought, etc., etc. It's a major issue over the legitimacy of who is running the temple. That's a major, major argument. Who are the legitimate priests in the temple? And the Qumran, or the Dead Sea Scroll community, whether they're Qumran or not, are arguing that the priests who are leading, the Maccabee priests who are leading the high priesthood in Jerusalem, are basically not legitimate. And that they should be the ones who should be leading sacrifices in the temple. They're legitimate. The priests in Jerusalem are not legitimate. In terms of other groups as well, there are major theological differences. Say the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Again, the Pharisees are the forerunner of the rabbis. The Sadducees are priests and aristocrats. Sadducees believe only in a written law, in the written Torah. The Pharisees believe in an oral law. They believe that Moses received an oral law from God at Sinai along with the written law, and that the oral law explains many aspects of the written law. I'll give you one example. I don't want to keep you too long, but one example is an eye for an eye. You look at the written script, it says an eye for an eye. Obviously, you take somebody's eye out, you get your eye taken out. Well, the rabbis said, or the Pharisees said, again, the forerunners of the rabbis, they said, well, the oral law comes along to tell us that an eye for an eye doesn't mean literally. It means that if you take somebody's eye out, you have to pay compensation for injury, for trauma, and for time lost at the job. It is not you take out another person's eye. So what the oral law does, whether it's a legal fiction or it's something real that was given to Moses at Sinai, whatever it is a way for the Pharisees to give a much more liberal and open interpretation of the law than the Sadducees. As well, the Pharisees believed in immortality of the soul. They believed in the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees did not. The Sadducees did not believe in resurrection of the dead because it was not mentioned in the 5 books of Moses. It's not in the Torah. The Pharisees believed it was in the oral law. The Sadducees had no oral law. There was no resurrection mentioned in the 5 books of Moses. Therefore, the Sadducees didn't have resurrection in their theology, while the Pharisees did, and certainly later on Christians did as well. And the rabbis. Any other questions or comments? I thank you all.